topic of today's conversation is dyslexia. What causes it? Why is it such a big thing in the traditional school system? How come that in certain other contexts it's virtually unknown as a phenomenon? There's a lot of things to dive into there.
Yeah, so I've come to be interested in dyslexia as a result of a lot of my research on self-directed education. I've long been studying children's learning in contexts other than standard schools. So contexts of democratic schools, unschooling. And one of the observations I made a long time ago was there's a remarkable lack of dyslexia among these kids. I began my research at a school called the Sudbury Valley School, where my son was a student. They don't even teach reading. The founder of the school, who died a couple of years ago, told me that out of hundreds of students at the school, he's never seen a real case of dyslexia. Everybody learns to read. And and I had begun to see similar reports from people doing unschooling. We just don't see dyslexia in these contexts. So that kind of raised some questions about what is dyslexia? Why are we seeing such high rates of dyslexia among school kids? One of my first studies, in fact, my first study kind of in the area of education at all, was a study of the graduates of the Sudbury Valley School that I did many years ago. And it turns out there were two of the graduates who had told me that they came to the school at age 15. They had been diagnosed with dyslexia in the public school. They came to Sudbury Valley, unable to read, and they both told me that they learned how to read within a few months of being at the school. So, yeah, so I asked them, well, how could this be? Why, here you went to age 15 in a place where they actually teach reading. And now you've come to a place where they don't even teach reading and you've learned to read. And I was interested in how they did it and what they think was different. And it's interesting that both of them, they told me, they basically told me the same story, which was, as one of them put it, for the first time in my life, nobody cared if I could read. Wasn't that interesting? He learned to read because for the first time in his life, nobody cared if he could read. No pressure. Once the pressure was off, he said, he could begin to think about reading. I don't remember which one of them. One of them kind of just picked it up. The other one asked for some help from a staff member who, it wasn't anything like the intense training you would give in school, but who helped him, pointed out, there's a code here. These are the way the letters sound, and helped them learn to read. So the thing that is interesting when you look at kids who learn to read out of the school context, they all learn to read, but at very different ages. You learn to read when you're interested in it, when you really want to do it. And that interest comes at different ages for different kids for a variety of reasons. Some kids are just into things that don't really involve reading, and they have no particular interest in reading when they're outside of the school context. But at some point, they get interested in reading, and then they learn to read. Some years later, I did a little study, a very informal study. I asked in one of my blog posts, I asked for readers who had a child who had been diagnosed with dyslexia while in a standard school, and who then took the child out of school, either for homeschooling or for democratic schooling of some sort, some non-traditional kind of schooling. What I wanted to know is, what age was the child when you took them out, and what happened about reading after you took the child out. The result was that there were 10 parents who responded to this survey. Uh, the age at which they took their child out of school varied from about 7 to about 11. And in every case, they said the child had been diagnosed with dyslexia and couldn't read when they took the child out of school. And when I analyzed the stories, what I found was that every one of them said that their child eventually learned how to read, but that but that it didn't happen right away. And they said that basically what all of them said in one way or another was my child was traumatized about reading. My child hated reading. My child would get angry at me if I asked him to practice reading or her. That child had an emotional reaction about reading that was preventing the child from even trying. And so in every case, what they said was, I just had to give up trying to push my child to read. Eventually, the child cooled off about reading and began to be interested in reading and then learned to read. Sometimes it took a couple of years for this to happen. Sometimes it took only a few months. But eventually, they all got interested in reading and they all learned to read. So what does this say? Let me tell you one other story. A study that was done a few years ago of children who had gone to a special preschool in Tennessee. So Tennessee developed a preschool program for children from homes that were below the poverty level. And it was a program designed to give kids from poor families a head start in school by giving fairly intensive training in reading and mathematical skills, especially. And um, and so it turns out there were more children, more parents who wanted to enroll their children than the program could accommodate the first year. So this set the occasion for a perfect experiment. The researchers decided on a random basis which kids would be in the program and which ones would not. And the researchers followed these kids up all the way through sixth grade. And here is the relevant point. On every single measure by sixth grade, even by third grade, this was true, but it's even more true by sixth grade. On every single measure, the kids who were not in the program were doing better than the kids who were in the program. They were scoring higher on reading, they were scoring higher on math, they were scoring higher on every academic test and they had less behavioral problems than those who were in the program. Here is the point regarding dyslexia. The ones who were in the program were 50% more likely to have been diagnosed with a learning disorder. The study didn't say what the learning disorders were, but my guess is that most of them would have been dyslexia because that's the one most commonly diagnosed. So here was a program that was aimed at pushing little kids to learn how to read when they're 4 years old. And the result was a dramatic increase in dyslexia among those kids. So what does that tell us about dyslexia? People like to say, educators like to say that this is a brain problem, it's genetic, it's so on and so forth. But the truth of the matter is, nobody is diagnosed with dyslexia by looking at their brain. That's not how it's diagnosed. Nobody is diagnosed with dyslexia by analyzing their genes. How are they diagnosed? They're diagnosed by if you have gone through the standard school system, been taught how to read, and haven't learned it, you will, and this goes on for a period of time, you will likely get a diagnosis of dyslexia. Now, they may give you a little test of dyslexia. The test isn't a brain test. They're not looking at the brain. There's no way you can find differences in the brain that are big enough that you could pick them up by brain scans or something like that. The test is something that, it might be a test of your ability to hear certain sounds and distinguish them, a test of your ability to pick out letters when they're flashed on a screen, things like that. So then they come up with this idea that this is a difference in ability to process certain sounds or the ability to distinguish letters quickly. But what if really the ability to do those things improves if you can read, right? So they're saying that it's the lack of ability to do that that causes the lack of reading, but maybe it's the reverse. We value our school system so much and so irrationally that we're unwilling to say that the problem is school. Kids don't learn something, we say the problem is the child's brain.
The thing is, I guess, if we said the problem is school, I mean that would create a lot of other problems, wouldn't it, for
That's
society and for
right.
people in general. I mean, that would be huge to say that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess it makes sense from a system point of view to focus on the reasons being elsewhere. But I think, like, as you were talking, I'm thinking, could you say that actually the term dyslexia or what it covers, really, you're actually describing like the effects of something rather than the causes of it?
Yes, I think so. I never say somebody has dyslexia. I also say also never say somebody has ADHD. That makes it seem like this
Mm.
is a part of them. This is
Yes.
an intrinsic part of them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But so I say somebody who's been diagnosed with
Mm-hmm.
dyslexia or somebody who's
Mm.
been diagnosed
Mm-hmm.
with this. It means that that somebody has that some official person has said you have this characteristic,
Mm.
and
Mm.
that's what it means. What is it that leads eventually to these diagnoses? Where do they arrive from? They essentially always begin in school. So school is a place where the goal is to make everybody the same.
Mm.
Everybody's supposed to learn the same curriculum. They're supposed to learn it at the same time in the same way. Now, a certain percentage, because children are very flexible and accommodating generally, can do it to a certain degree. But some children, for whatever reason, don't. And it might be stubbornness, you know, it might be a willfulness, it might be maybe their brains are a little bit different, and so they're really not quite interested in learning to read at age 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever age the school wants them to learn to read. But all of these things in the real world are all within the realm of normal. They're not having any particular difficulties dealing in the real world. But in school, they're not meeting what the school says you have to do.
I read your book, Free to Learn, and I'm super interested in the whole, our society, how we've developed and how our society is structured and the way we function and live compared to the hunter-gatherer type. It's so interesting how all of these things are just not there. All these problems that we have with the stress and the diagnosis, why don't they have that? Like people who live differently. But anyway, what I really wanted to say was that you at somewhere in your book you say something about children being designed by nature to learn through self-directed play and exploration. And in our society today, we kind of deprive them more and more of that freedom. You talk about how kids are now subjected to, you call it tedious, and let me just see, I'm just going to look up painfully slow learning methods that are used in school. So the other day I was talking to someone else about this topic, about dyslexia, from a perspective of neuropedagogy. She said there is no biological need for reading. So it's not something that's, evolutionary a necessity. What she said was that's part of the reason why it's hard for some, or harder for some than others, to learn, because reading requires something different. It requires the brain to work in a different way, and it requires a cognitive development, first of all, that you need to have before you can even think about learning to read. So if kids can, and they can, because we've seen it in the unschooling communities and the self-directed schools, we see it all the time, they can and do learn to read on their own. How do you then, how can we explain that when you think about what this person said about reading requiring something different and there's no evolutionary or biological need?
This is a very common view, and it's wrong. It is true that throughout most of our evolutionary history, there was no written word. People weren't reading. Hunter-gatherers didn't have dyslexia because they didn't read. Right? So the so reading is a new skill. Reading is something new that's come into the world. There are lots of new things in the world, and even hunter-gatherers had new things in the world. So kids learn things, not just things that they're sort of genetically primed to learn. They learn all kinds of things through their natural efforts. In terms of brain mechanisms, if you think about it, learning to read probably is making use of the very same genetic brain mechanisms of learning to talk. Learning spoken language, if you think about it, is way more complex than learning to read. And once you've got spoken language, reading is just simple. I mean, it's just in English, a 26-letter code here that you have to learn. It's a little more complicated than that because we don't totally follow the code, but not much more. The idea that this is so different I think I think that the reason people say this is because we teach reading in school to kids who, for the most part, haven't learned how to read on their own by the time we start teaching them reading. Most kids on their own, as I said, don't learn to read by the time they're 5 or 6 years old. So we're teaching reading to people who aren't interested in it. And you try to teach it to a class and keep everybody at the same pace. And you're using readers that have been designed to use for the whole class. You're teaching reading under the worst possible conditions. So, of course, it's slow, it's tedious. You could walk into any university library where they've got a Department of Education, and there are shelves and shelves of books about how to teach reading. I mean, this has been such a debated thing, and so many arguments and theories about it. We make such a big deal of it. And then when you go and you look at kids outside of school and they just learn to read, these are two different things. So the problem is, reading becomes difficult when you try to force kids to learn to read who aren't particularly interested in it, and when you're trying to do it in a classroom where everybody has to learn in the same way at the same time. That makes reading difficult.
So do you think that the main problem with regards to dyslexia is really about the interest, and not so much about whether or not someone is, on a matter of the brain, like cognitively ready, capable,
Right.
whatever? Like, I think that comes into play because, like you said, some kids very young, my oldest daughter, she was 2.5 when she started being interested in letters and wanting to learn to read.
Right.
That's quite young. And then I have a son who was way beyond 10, which is not even that late,
Right.
but he was way beyond 10 until he actually was really interested and really
Right.
learned how to read. So I've seen that difference. And I think there is, because we're all different. So I think there's something to this. There's a truth to the fact that all of our individual brains are individually wired, if you could say that way. So certainly I think some people are like wired or disposed to learning to read earlier than others, and some maybe naturally have more difficulty in, I don't know, the whole thing about representing an image, like seeing a word and representing like that function of that's the same when you learn to speak, right? But you can like you point to something and you say, oh, that's a cup, that's a table, that's a cow, and you need to be able to have that image, know what a cow is, and have that image in your
Right.
head. And so certainly I think there's something to that. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that this is less important, that the real important thing is the motivation and the interest. And that's really the crux of it.
I think that's right. I mean, I can't rule out the possibility. In fact, it's quite likely that there are some individual brain differences that make reading a little more difficult or a little bit easier for some people than other people. Just like some people, some kids learn language
Yeah.
more quickly than others, you know. So I think there's some difference, but I think that the primary difference, we actually did a little study of learning to read at the Sudbury Valley School many years ago. A couple of my undergraduate students really did this study that involved interviewing kids and their parents and the staff members uh, uh, concerning kids who had entered the school unable to read and had learned to read while they were at the school. The questions that were asked were, when did this child learn to read? Where you would say the child could actually read fluently, where they could pick up things and read, and the limiting factor was not ability to read, but just whether they could understand the material. We also asked the child, we asked the parents, we asked the staff member, so what do you think happened in this child's life, or especially with the children who learned to read somewhat later, where they could remember and they were consciously learning to read, what led you to want to learn to read? What led you to learn to read? And pretty much every child who learned to read late enough that they were consciously deciding to learn to read, it was because they reached a point where they felt they really wanted to learn to read. Yeah, they were motivated. So one child put it kind of this way. He said, I kept seeing these kids who were reading stuff, maybe it was comic books or, and they were laughing at it and they were really enjoying what they were reading. And I wanted to join that club. So I decided I was going to learn to read. The research that's been done on very early readers seems to show the following, that the one thing that's common among them is that they're in families where a lot of reading goes on and they were read to a lot. So that's part of it. But the other thing from those studies is the children who learn to read early are not necessarily remarkable in any other way. They don't have higher RQs necessarily. They don't necessarily learn other things. They're not like they're little geniuses in every possible way. And so that again is consistent with the idea that they just got interested in reading, and that's why they learned to read. And that reading is actually not all that hard. So that's my view of it. There's no anybody who's really been involved observing kids learning when they're interested knows that the difference in a child's learning ability when they're interested versus when they're not interested is night and day. I mean, children are little learning geniuses when they're interested in something. They've got amazing memories. They've got amazing abilities to pick up better than adults, to pick up the details of things and remember them and put them together. Mother Nature endowed children with that precisely because Mother Nature knew that children have to learn so much. So children are remarkably good learners when they're doing it under their own steam and when they're interested. But when we force it on them and they're not interested, and we're trying to get them to learn by reward and punishment and pushing them, uh,
Yeah, I think we all know that that is one of the main problems of the traditional school paradigm and the way
right,
learning is handled in the traditional system. Um, and the funny thing, I mean, it's not actually funny, but the weird thing is that the system also knows it because, at least in Denmark, when you have someone who's said to have a learning disability or learning disorder of some kind, they're having trouble in the normal school. So maybe they're at some point allowed to go to a special school or a special ed class. And those classes are usually centered around whatever interests the child, because then the
uh-huh.
child learns faster, better, etc. Hallelujah. And you're like, yeah. It's like I really get sad. I get sad and I get angry on behalf of
Yes,
all the children that aren't allowed that experience, because it's just so wrong that you have to have a diagnosis, or you have to be different, or you have to be special, and before you are allowed that freedom and that courtesy, to
right.
be in control of your own learning and to have the learning adapted to you rather than the other way around. But I digress, because that's not really the subject. But I just think no one wants to be helpless. Everyone wants to be as autonomous as possible, to be able to participate in their, like, the society and that they're a part of. Everyone wants to master the tools of the society that they're a part of. So I think when kids see that a particular tool is handy, interesting, fun, is of use to them for some reason, for something, obviously at some point they want to master that skill, the use of that tool. And reading is a tool that is used in our culture, so it makes perfect sense. But yeah, in the school system, for some reason, that aspect is completely disregarded. Would it be a stretch to say that dyslexia is something that school creates?
I don't think it's a stretch at all. No, I think it's absolutely true. Dyslexia is something that school creates. I don't want to rule out the possibility that there is some tiny fraction of the population that does have a brain problem. I can't rule that out. It's a tiny fraction. None of them happen to have ever been students at the Sudbury Valley School. It's hard to prove that it never ever exists. But I think it's easy to say that the the large numbers of people that get diagnosed with dyslexia, it's not primarily a brain problem. It's primarily a school problem. There is, I think, another thing that can happen with labeling. I think that unfortunately, you're right. To get some kind of individual help in school, you have to get a diagnosis. You have to get labeled. So you actually have parents shopping for labels. They'll find a doctor who will be willing to label their kid as having some disorder, because then the child gets this break in school.
Yeah.
If not special education, they get more time to take their tests. They get more time.
Yes.
Now, isn't this sad? The idea of parents looking to to find some label on their child, that and then the child has this negative label, and I don't think that's a good thing. Sometimes it can be a relief to the child to say, "Oh, that's why," "Oh, it's not my fault. I just have this disorder, whatever it is, dyslexia. That's why I can't read." But on the other hand, there can be a harmful effect of that. That can be an excuse then not to try to learn to read. That can be a statement that disempowers you, that says to you, I'm not able to learn to read because my brain is different, you know. Fortunately, the kids in these studies that I've done, they hadn't arrived at that conclusion, though they maybe did arrive at that conclusion initially, but they finally overcame it. And but I could imagine that there are some people who get that label, dyslexia, and then they just give up and they go through life. They manage. They find ways of doing. They have people read to them. There are people, even I've heard of people who are the heads of major businesses, and they just hire somebody to do their reading for them. So it's not as tragic as we might think it would be if you can't read. But on the other hand, I can't help but wonder if these people are just people who gave up on the idea that they could read. And if you give up on the idea, you just close that possibility off for yourself, then you won't ever learn how to read.
Well, I also think if you're told something long enough, then eventually you start believing it yourself. So these people have been told from a very early age that they
Right,
have a problem. That's what the schools do. They point to the child and they tell the child, you have a problem with
right,
reading.
right,
When actually that's not really, well, I mean, there is a problem, but the problem is not what the school thinks it is or what the
right,
school says it is. So and I think that's probably the tragic part of it, is that you have people growing up their whole lives feeling that they're wrong, feeling something's wrong with them, and
right.
having trouble, like having a very hard time in the system and just in life in general. Partly because there's so much focus on it and they're being told all the time and in different ways,
Right.
oh, you have this problem.
There's one more thing that I think is worth saying, and that is that kids who learn to read on their own are not learning to read through phonics. They're learning to read by identifying words that are meaningful to them, putting those words together to read larger things, and at some point inferring the phonics. Or maybe they will ask for help for phonics. The phonics then comes easy once but the point is, right off, they're reading for meaning. Now, in school, there are two classic theories about how to teach reading. One is sort of the phonics method, and the other is sort of the whole word, trying to mimic in the classroom the way children learn naturally when they're out of the classroom. Now, it turns out that every study, there are experiments done within schools to compare those two methods. Every study that tries to compare them shows that phonics works best. So in school, phonics works best. The whole word method doesn't work well in school. And I think there's a good reason for that. The whole word method only works if the child is interested. It's worthless it just becomes memorizing those words if the child isn't interested in what that word means. Interest. So you can't create the interest, but you can force children in school to do the phonics. You're getting them through rote procedures to know the sound of A. A is ah or A. B, b, and so on. You teach them to mouth the words. And when they can look at a syllable and mouth it, we call that reading. But it's not reading because they're not doing it to get the meaning. They're just doing it to produce the sounds that they're supposed to produce. And when you learn to read that way, are you actually even really learning to read? What you're learning to do is to produce sounds from the page. And I think because when children learn that way, and that's why they still don't get this idea that the purpose of reading is to get meaning out of what's there. One of the amazing things that we see in our school systems, certainly in American school systems, is although most kids learn to read in a certain sense and that they can pronounce the words, their reading ability is still bad later on in school. They're poor readers. They're not good readers, even when they're in third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, sometimes even high school. They'll read a paragraph and they can read the paragraph, but then you ask them, what did the paragraph say? And they're not very good at it, right? And this is the kind of ability that they really need to have to do well in school. And so one of the reasons a lot of kids don't do well in school is they still aren't really reading well. So that's very different from, it's a kind of way that you're learning how to read in a shallow way. You think you know how to read, but you're not really reading because you don't really have internalized the sense that the purpose of this is to look at that page and extract meaning from it, not sound from it. I think it helps explain why a lot of kids that attend democratic schools or are unschooled and learn to read in their own way actually become big readers and good readers. Even kids who learn very late in reading. I used to say in talks that nobody ever left Sudbury Valley School unable to read. And finally somebody approached me and he said, that's not actually true. I left I left Sudbury Valley not knowing how to read. I graduated not knowing how to read, but I wanted to go to college, he said. So I learned how to read within a couple of months after I left Sudbury Valley. And he went on to major in philosophy, of all things, and he's a big reader today. So this is the absolute extreme of somebody who didn't learn how to read, even in this context at Sudbury Valley, where everybody else is learning how to read. For some reason at least he claims he couldn't read by the time he left school, but he decided to go to college, and he knew he had to know how to read to go to college, and so he learned it.
So we're back to meaning and motivation.
Yes,
Really.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If someone is listening to this conversation and having a child that maybe is exhibiting a bit of difficulty, someone is a bit worried about their kid and reading, what would you say to them?
I would just say, don't worry. I would say read to them, be sure that you have a literary home, that you have a literary environment, and certainly don't shame the child for not being able to read. Don't push it. Don't push it. Follow the child's interests, and they will learn how to read.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you. That's been fun.